So listen, we have it's a family gathering, so if y'all are inclined, I said this to my friends back here, just come in the middle. We can just have a conversation if you're inclined, no pressure. I know sometimes folks like to stay in different spaces. So welcome, welcome. It's really good to see everybody here. Really good to be here with you, Dr. Samuel.
Yeah, good to be here.
Yes. So this is, you may have noticed in the description of this session that it says podcast recording. And just to give you a little bit of context of what that's all about, I have the real privilege of working with an incredible team of philanthropists and impact investors that are building out a podcast on people we call systems catalysts. And then Dr. Samuel is a brilliant example of a systems catalyst, and we'll talk a bit more about what we mean. But that means that we have been talking to incredible leaders who are using a different collaborative approach to transform systems from the root. And this conversation is going to be part of that series. And part of what we realized is, we started the conversation, and the team, I should say, is Jeff Walker and English Saul and myself. And we started the process, and, we've been writing some articles and doing some interviews and such, but we realized the oral tradition has an important role to play in this conversation. We really need to draw on the power of oral tradition in relationships. So now you all are part of that, and we're so glad that you are. But that's what the catalyst piece is all about. And what we'll do is we'll dig into a bit of Dr. Samuel, your story, and a little bit of what makes you really a different kind of leader that we believe that we need right now. And then, depending on timing, we may open it up for a little bit of Q&A. We'll see how the conversation flows. Fair enough? Okay. Fair enough. All right. So first, let me start with a little bit more of an introduction of Dr. Aaliyah Samuel. I said before that when we talk about systems catalysts, we're talking about people who aren't just taking the status quo and making incremental changes. We're talking about people who are looking at the root. We're talking about people who understand that coalitions are key to change. And we're talking about people who aren't afraid to say the thing and speak truth to power. And so in even the short time that I've known you, I've seen that you have all of those traits. But first, let me talk a little bit about your role. Now, I know you by CASEL. I know your organization by CASEL, but I've got to break down the acronym. So Dr. Aaliyah Samuel is the president and CEO of the Collaborative for Academic, Social, and Emotional Learning, affectionately known as CASEL. And CASEL is a real national, I would say global leader around social emotional learning. And as we know, social emotional learning these days is something that young people need. We have evidence of that. It's also something that has been politicized. And so we're going to talk a little bit about what it means to navigate those waters. Dr. Samuel has been a leader across multiple sectors. She's been a teacher, she's been a school principal, and she's been a leader in the Department of Education. So she's an example of a multi-sector leader and brings all of that experience to bear in the work that she does. So I'm going to start with the easy one. Talk to the good people about CASEL and what's the work of CASEL.
So thank you, Tulaine. CASEL is a nonprofit. We began over 25 years ago really focusing on social emotional learning. And what's interesting, and one of the things that drew me to CASEL over the years, because I actually had multiple touch points with CASEL before coming in as president and CEO, is that it really focuses on three aspects: the research, the practice, and the policy when it comes to social emotional learning. And one of the things I really believe, I've seen over the course of my career, is that when you thread the three of those really intentionally, that's where the magic happens. And I think that's why CASEL has been so successful, and really this movement of social emotional learning is that it braids the policy, the practice, and the research. And so we have been taking this conversation around social emotional learning head on. I mean, as you mentioned, it has been politicized, but it's also something that's not brand new. As a former teacher and assistant principal and principal, like many of the practices and tenets of social emotional learning, both for students and adults, it's just good practice. It's just being a good educator. It's just being, focusing on relationships, understanding other people's perspectives, and really having a really rich classroom environment where students feel like they can bring their whole selves to school every day. And so it's just been an amazing journey. I'm 4 months in. And
4 months.
4 months.
Wow.
Yes. And
we can clap for that. That's a good thing. That's amazing. It's amazing. So listen, talking about being 4 months in, you jumped into leading CASEL at a time where, as we said, social emotional learning is both clearly needed it's evidence-based at this point, and it's also been, sort of somehow woven into this really kind of fiery landscape. Why did you choose to jump into the fire right now?
Yeah. So, prior to this role, I was a Deputy Assistant Secretary at the U.S. Department of Education, which, being on the landing team of an administration, so that's the first team that comes in after inauguration, we were in the midst of a pandemic, trying to reopen schools, vaccines hadn't rolled out, like there were all these components that we were trying to navigate. And I like to use the example that at that time, that work, I really felt like I was under a heat lamp in a restaurant, when they serve up the food and they put it under the heat lamp to keep it warm. And all the while, I knew I was doing great work. It was an extraordinary experience. I realized I couldn't use my voice in the way that I wanted and needed to. And
Why couldn't you use your voice, just to make sure I'm understanding that?
yes, as a political appointee or a presidential appointee, you really are under the apparatus of government. And you have to be very mindful of what you say, how you say, when you move. And there were just a lot of things that were starting to creep up and become very evident to me, where I felt like, although I was doing really meaningful work, I had a powerful position, I'm in a sub-cabinet level role, I wasn't able to address certain components of education as I would have wanted to, as a parent, as a practitioner, and as somebody who'd been in the policy space. And so, and to your point, right now, more than ever, in education, we need strong leadership. And as I started to see, I traveled from state to state, I was talking to mayors, governors, superintendents, parents, and they're all talking about the importance of social emotional learning. And then I started to see how political it was becoming, and I was like, this is not okay. Like, as a parent, I've seen it, as I'm talking to educators, like, we really need a strong voice. And when CASEL came to me about the opportunity, I went from jumping from underneath the heat lamp straight into the fire, and I wouldn't change it, quite honestly. Like, I think one of the things that excites me the most about this work is that, yes, it is political. Yes, it is getting a lot of attention, some good, some bad, some in between. There's a lot of questions. But because I have served in so many different roles, that I'm able to approach the conversation in a way that brings a certain level of credibility and also respect. And that's what I enjoy. If I'm talking to parent audiences, I can say, look, my youngest was in kindergarten when the pandemic started. My oldest was in 3rd grade. Let's talk about how difficult that was. Like, I can connect in a different way. For policymakers who are trying to navigate the political landmines, their constituents that they have to serve, I can talk to them because I've worked with almost every nation's governor over my last few years. Like, to be able to have a different level of conversation, and people want that connective tissue, and I think I can bring that in different ways.
They do want that connective tissue, right? We've been talking a lot at this event about connection. And that community and connection is literally medicine for our physical bodies, our biology, and certainly medicine for our wellness and mental health, particularly for our young people who are really going through it right now, who are really going through it. So that you talk about that credibility. I feel like you're also talking about proximity, that you have proximity to the lived experience of the parent navigating the school system, of the school or district leader navigating relationships with state government and bureaucracies. Like, you've been there and have not just an empathy, but a knowledge and an expertise informed by your proximity. And we believe that that's one of the traits of a systems catalyst, right? That being proximate to the system that you're trying to change or transform or rebuild is an essential piece, and you have that. But another element that we've seen is that systems catalyst leaders, they have this duality, right? They tend to be both students of history and futurists, right? And they carry both at the same time. So I want to ask you, Dr. Samuel, how has history informed the world that you envision in education?
That's such a great question. And, I will say, as I think about my current role at CASEL, because I'm still in that very steep learning curve, I am very much observing the landscape to try to figure out what's that right lever to move. But historically, in my past roles, I'll give you a couple of examples. When I was at the National Governors Association, I ran the education division. So I provided education support to all the governors, their chiefs of policy, their director of policies, their governor's education advisors on a variety of issues. And I realized that as a woman of color in this role, I was the first woman of color to hold that role. It's a very powerful position. And how was I going to use this role to talk about equity at a time when we had 33 Republican governors? You know, the constituency was changing, but I knew I couldn't hold this place and space without moving in this direction of equity, and not targeted universalism, equity, like truly unpacking it.
Can I just pause you there? So for the listeners, not what you just said was, there was some technical language in there that I want to make sure people understand, right?
So targeted universalism is kind of an approach for all. Like if we give everything, you know, if we give something to everyone, we'll be good. And equity is understanding that individuals have different needs at different junctures and that we really should be approaching what they need at that moment. And the approach to education, particularly at the Governors Association then, was a targeted universal. Let's just give something to everyone and hope that you get what you need. And to shift from that was a huge paradigm shift. And so one of the things I did, understanding my platform and the convening ability, is I actually took about 30 of the nation's governor's education advisors on a trip down history lane. I actually took them to Little Rock, Arkansas for a 2.5-day meeting where they were able to hear directly from Minnie Jean Brown Trickey, who was one of the Little Rock Nine, on what education equity was. I took them to Central High School. We walked up the steps. We actually took that historical journey and then started to backtrack. This was then. But let's talk about now and how some of these parallels are the same, from school funding formulas and how we finance schools, from the lack of opportunity and access, the lack of diversity in the teacher workforce, like all of these things, but directly connected it to Little Rock and Central High. We took them to the memorial. So there is a way, by acknowledging the lessons of the past and tying them to the realities of the current, to be able to say, we need to envision a better future, and we still have a whole lot of work to do.
We really do. I mean, that transition to getting such a powerful governing body to focus on equity, accurately defined, because people are using that word a lot. And I find the word equity is kind of like the word respect. If you polled a group of people, 10 people, you get 10 different answers of what it means and what it looks like. Right. One thing I'm wrestling with a lot in my work, and I help run a venture philanthropy fund, and one of the things I'm wrestling with in my work is this issue of how do we move past the notion that the same set of interventions will work for everybody, because there's such a collective denial about our shared history and the different ways that bias is really a shapeshifter. The way it shows up for me as a woman in Black American identity, it shows up differently for someone who has a different identity, but it's still very present. And it's so hard to get people to understand that, never mind talk about it, never mind design interventions that honor it. And so I just wonder, Dr. Samuel, how have you been able to get a room of folks who have no idea about this history, who have some defensiveness about this history, to understand it well enough to change their strategy to an equity-driven strategy?
So first I'll have to say, it's a real recognition that having these conversations, you can get one of two outcomes. You can either approach it in a way that shut people down and people are automatically disengaged, or recognize that you can be a key to unlock at least, if not conversations, an awareness of, wait a minute, maybe it's not what I thought it was. And for me, understanding that even if I can unlock the awareness, that's a win in itself. And I think it's really important to use data, and data tells its own story. And there are some that have a hard time even with data. But when you start to look at the data and the story that it's telling us, it's not a coincidence. When there are parallels and similarities, community by community, state by state, country by country, this is not coincidence. And so you have to start to really at least question, well, why are there so many similarities? And just start the dialogue from there.
I mean, I really love that because when we think about a systems catalyst, I think the ability to do what you just walked us through, to have enough empathy for the humanity of the party you're seeking to enroll, to work with the way, as all humans, very few of us, I kind of wonder at how we work to advance equity sometimes because we kind of act like human beings aren't human beings. I don't know that many humans who proactively will stay at the table if you're telling them about all the things that they failed at, how ignorant they are, and how much harm they've caused, and that's all you talk to them about. Like, there's a handful of folks who will stay, but they may have some other issues at play that you actually don't want in the mix. So I think that there's something about how can we do this work in a way that is authentic, unapologetic, and honors that most human beings want to see a way that they can engage versus simply be told what they failed at and how they've hurt others.
I totally agree. And also, it's a journey. I think about where I am now in my equity journey. It's very different than it was 10 years ago, 15 years ago, or even 20 years ago.
Yeah.
And so I think approaching it, understanding that each one of us are at different juncture points of this journey, that allows people the wiggle room to be able to say, I'm not in the same place, or I don't see it how you see it. And it at least serves as a broker to conversation, because it's okay for us to be at different start points, but at least can we agree to take this journey together? It's a much better, in my opinion, it's an approach to bring people along than making them feel like they've been left behind or there's no space for them to grow.
Right. Now that is a view that I personally share. It's not always a popular way. It's not always a popular stance. I think that in this work of building an equitable world together, none of us have lived in an equitable world. And there are a lot of kind of binaries out there. You're either for community or you're for, profit, or you're, right? I mean, there's sort of very oversimplified, narrow camps that we're supposed to sign on to and pledge our loyalty forever. And I think one of the things that's true about a systems catalyst is that, you're able to see the full landscape. You're able to see the connections that aren't as visible to others. You're able to kind of tell when you're being sold an oversimplified story, and you're able to weave coalitions that can create something new. And I see that in your work and hear that even in how you're responding in this conversation. But here is one thing I want to ask you. What gets hard about being that bridge builder, that connector, that translator? What's hard about that?
So if I'm 100% honest, to me, the hardest part is knowing when you have to take a step back and refill your own cup. Because I think people who are coalition builders, people who are bridge builders, you give relentlessly. You're consistently giving, understanding, trying to broker a different perspective. You're trying to, put your perspective aside. You're trying to remain neutral, but that doesn't mean that you don't have an opinion or you're moving. You're just trying to remain neutral to get to consensus. And sometimes it is exhausting. And being able to say, I need a minute. And truly refill yourself. And I think that for me has been the biggest struggle. And I think too, when you represent multiple audiences, the constant filtering of different perspectives can also be exhausting, because you're constantly, the wheels are always turning, trying to figure out what the right next move is. And being willing to acknowledge when I need to take a step back and just refuel, re-energize, encourage my own soul to get back at it.
I love that. So a good systems catalyst needs to have a strong restoration strategy.
Yes.
Right?
Yes.
And that's really important, because if you're doing it well, which you certainly are, Dr. Samuel, it doesn't look like you're doing it. Right? Like people don't see you sort of assessing, here's 5 different people coming from 5 different vantage points and sectors, and here's the commonality they share, and here's how I need to say it 5 different ways for them each to hear me. I mean, I know that calculus, and I know that it takes a lot. And when you do it well, people aren't aware it's happening. It just kind of looks like magic. Right?
So true. I actually tell my husband that all the time, that this is not magic. This is hard work. I also think, there have been moments in my career where I have had to choose position and power over passion and purpose, or the other way around. And knowing when to utilize that. I always, my passion and purpose have always driven me. I've left jobs because it didn't align with what I believed in. So that's always there, but also recognizing that sometimes you have to have that position. You have to be in a position of power in order to move your passion and your purpose. And so that's another really delicate balance of not being lost in that, because I've seen too many extraordinary leaders that once that they get a taste of that power or that position, they forget about the passion and purpose, and I refuse to ever let that be me. But I recognize you have to have a balance of the two and know when to use it. So that's another really important thing in leadership. Don't get caught up in the position and the power. Remember why you're using it.
Remember why you're using it, and remember that it's all fragile. I mean, that's, my mentors have always taught me that, and, I have one mentor that used to say to me, like, don't ever believe your own press. That was the shorthand way that she helped me. And actually, she was my mentor from the Cambridge Public School System. So shout out to Dr. Caroline Hunter. Yeah, and that's something about that. Because when we're working to change these systems, you're absolutely right. We have to be able to navigate them and build power, whether through our position, our access, or our bases of support. Mm-hmm. And that is essential to be effective. And yet, it's also counterculture to try to change all of that, So how do you, let me ask you, you made your commitment, your purpose and purpose-driven. How do you hold yourself accountable to staying, keeping your eyes on the prize in that way, particularly as you're continuing to be in increasingly far-reaching roles that are powerful?
So I am first-generation American. My family's from the country of Panama. Came to the country when I was 8. And not coming from a place of privilege, not growing up in privilege, is really what anchors me in so many ways. I still have family in Panama that I have a fundamental obligation to support and help. It is not about me. I have 2 boys of color in the public school system in Virginia right now. And all the while, I don't worry about them. I do worry about them. But I know they have a stable home. They have a mom and dad who love them and who will advocate for them. But what keeps me up is all the other boys and girls who don't have that. So I don't have, and life is short. I'm still relatively young, but I also realize how fast life is moving. And there's too much riding on these positions, the changes right now, to be wasted space. And so that is what every day motivates me. There's just fundamentally too many people who need my voice, my representation, for me to show up in an authentic way, because they don't have anybody else there for them. And so that obligation, which I see in my own family, which I see in the families around me, is what keeps me not only humble, but hungry.
Yeah, that makes so much sense to me. It really resonates. A lot has been said at this event about this moment we're in. Thomas Friedman talks about the age of acceleration. There's so much. And so I guess a question for me is, let's come back to where we started, social emotional learning. One could argue that in an age of acceleration, that young people need social emotional learning, comprehensive development now more than ever. And somehow, in the midst of all this, we're in this sort of cauldron of controversy around, 1, teaching American history, but that's another workshop, and 2, around supporting young people in their emotional development. Talk to us a little bit about, what's the landscape? How did this become a political question versus simply an education?
Yeah, so I actually talked a little bit about this yesterday. I was on another panel. And really what has happened with the pandemic is that so many people got a bird's eye view of what education was or is, or how it was occurring for some, not for others. And so there fundamentally became, there's always been an acknowledgement of the importance of education, but it was just up front and center in a way that it has not been. And the inequities, whether it was inequity by race, it was inequity by access, if you were rural and didn't, or even some urban pockets, if you didn't have access to technology, and how it played out over time. And so the spotlight on education has really created audiences who are engaged in a different way, but also misinformed. And when you have heightened engagement with misinformation, it can be disastrous in multiple arenas. And I think that's what we're seeing in education. And one of the things we have to do is to really inform people what it is and being very clear on this is what it is. And also, I think, focusing on the skills that are gained. Because if you ask any of these politicians, or even if all of us take a journey and think about our favorite teacher growing up, what do you think about? The classroom environment, the relationship that you had. And I guarantee you probably did best in that class because of the relationship, because you felt seen, because you were like all of those pieces. And that's what we're trying to make sure that we emphasize. You look at the number of young people who are disengaged from school altogether. They're either dropping out, the absenteeism rates, like all of these pieces are happening because students don't feel connected to their school environment. So if you don't feel connected to your school environment, you can't perform your best academically. And so it really is this opportunity to inform people as far as what it is, and also help folks understand that if we don't get this right, the implications are far greater than we're willing to pay.
That's exactly what I wanted to follow on with. Like, what are the stakes as it relates to, advancing well-designed, thoughtful, data-driven, social, emotional learning in our school systems? Like, what's at stake? What are we risking?
So I'll give you a real-time example. There are about 140,000 high schoolers that have not been accounted for. They just dropped out. They don't know where they are. You take those high schoolers that have not been found, some places call them the missing, and you think about, okay, if they don't graduate high school, what will their lifetime income be? Which means we have that group, then wait a minute, they will have children, possibly, so then we're gonna have another group of young people growing up in poverty. We know that with lack of education, you're more likely to have health issues. Let's start adding this up. And right now, we have about 140,000 young adults that are, if we don't do something, and how do we get them back? We engage them. We need to find them, make them feel seen, help them get connected. And so it's workforce. There's an impact to our workforce. There's an impact to our longer economy. And there's multi-generational impacts if we don't get this right.
So that's sobering and important for us to hear and understand. Now, what I noticed is that you talked about schools, it being our job to engage. You didn't say it was about motivation levels, right? And I have heard different conversations in, the sort of social impact education space about motivation. And there's been a lot of interventions over the years that have been designed to motivate the, seemingly unmotivated young person. And very few of them have been successful because I think the focus is incorrect. So talk a little bit about the difference between engagement and motivation as you see it.
Yeah. So I'm so glad you brought that up because there are fundamental differences. When I think about motivation, that can be intrinsic or extrinsic, so internally driven or externally driven. And there are so many young people who are motivated, but they are not engaged and or connected to what's going on in the school environment, which is killing their motivation. Or they're dealing with systemic structures in place that even if they are motivated, they can't see a pathway open. And so engagement to me is really understanding what is it that you need to be connected in a way that's meaningful to you, that excites you, to also empower you to continue to move forward. I see it with I have a 7-year-old who is, and it's not because I'm his mom, but he is really very bright. But he is losing his motivation because how he's being taught and what he's being taught, he doesn't enjoy. And so we had to find a teacher to work with him after school. His name is Mr. James. He loves Mr. James. So he is engaged. He is in it in a whole nother way because of that connection, to the point where when he knows 4:30 is coming and it's his Mr. James day, he's at the door and he's like, Mr. James, get in here already, because he's engaged. But is he that way in school? No, and we're struggling with having to figure out how do we, the motivation we know he has, how do we help him have that show up in school every day in the environment that's not connecting with him? And we need to do, that engagement needs to happen not only with students, but our parents too.
Absolutely. I love it. I'm visualizing your son. What's some of your son's name?
Cruz.
Cruz. I'm visualizing Cruz saying, Mr. James, get in here already. I can like literally see it. I love it. It's a beautiful, beautiful image. Thank you for sharing it with us. So that's really powerful what you said. It's a key difference between, motivation, which is inherent in our young people, versus engagement, which is our responsibility as educators and adults who care for young people. And it's important, right? Because if your mental model is the former, you're going to design a very different set of responses than if you understand young people are already motivated, right? They come this way. It's kind of like how I think about resilience. There's so much conversation these days about resilience. And, my thing, and sometimes we will say for young people who maybe are not performing as well academically as we'd like to see, we say, well, they need to learn resilience. And my thing has always been, these young people have resilience in abundance. It's just that their resilience is being spent on survival as opposed to engagement and learning.
That's a whole word right there. But can we go back just another minute? Because I talked about the students and the teachers, parents as far as engagement. But fundamentally, to your point on system design, it's time for us to fundamentally redesign the education system. We've been playing Jenga with education for the last 50 years. And I don't know how many of you are familiar with Jenga, but it's the wooden structure and you pull one piece out and you put it on the top and hope that that structure stays. And we keep saying, this piece isn't working, let's move it and put it on the top. And the system of education itself is so weakened, not only by its design, but all of the different types of patchwork we've tried to do, that it's time for us to take a step back. How can we get kids ready for the future if many of them aren't even doing project-based learning? Like, you talk about engagement and motivation. I don't want to sit in a class, for 90 minutes when I could be hands-on doing something. And so I think fundamentally, it's not just about engaging and motivating, with air quotes, students. It's how do we create a system that truly allows them to bring their best every day?
Absolutely, absolutely. So you're a student of history, as you shared. You're a futurist. You can see the future. And so how do we move from where we are now, which is not satisfactory and not serving our young people in the ways they deserve? How do we move from here to the future you envision? What are the steps that we who are listening to you now should be taking?
So number one, I'm going to start with the politics, because people don't understand how fundamentally political education is. One, we need to get involved in our local elections, school board, mayors, governors, legislators. Get involved, know who the candidates are, because 90% of funding that goes into schools come from states. And if we don't have the right elected officials who work for us in these positions, it's not going to clear the pathway. So number one, we need to be very mindful of who we elect. And I'm not telling anybody who to vote for, but elections have consequences, so choose wisely. Number two is we need to get out of the way and allow educators to do what they do. Superintendents, teachers, get out of the way. And then I think third...
Let me pause on that one. That got a little bit of love from the audience, too. So let's expand on that a bit. What does that look like to get out of the way?
So right now, so many decisions that are being made by non-educators or those that have education background. And when I say get out of the way, it is if you're not going to include educators in the decision-making process, then at least have a stronger team. I'm thinking specifically at the local level. Many decisions that are made district by district are hierarchical. They're top down. They're not from the bottom up. And we need to be including, we talked about proximity. Those closest to the problem have the best solution. So why aren't we including teachers in the conversation in a more meaningful way? And so it is bringing that proximity to the problems that we're trying to solve within the system. And also partnerships. Which is something that at CASEL, our focus this year is really emphasizing school, community, and family partnerships. I mean, over the course of the pandemic, parents were involved in ways we haven't seen in years.
Absolutely.
So we need to keep that going. It shouldn't change now. And so then how do we think about strengthening those partnerships rather than severing them now that as, school doors open up? And so it's about communication. It's about the partnership.
Absolutely, absolutely. So we have just a few minutes left, and God, there's so much more I want to ask you. Let's talk a little bit more about what's giving you hope, where you're seeing bright spots, because I think that's important for us to understand. Systems change is a marathon; it's not a sprint. I'm sure, as a systems catalyst yourself, you have inspiration prescriptions that you fill so that you can stay at the table. So what's giving you hope? What is a bright spot you want to lift up?
So one of the things, honestly, that gives me hope is, there are shifts in education that we're seeing. And I think the pandemic, one of the things that it did is it forced a hard reset. And even though we aren't at a place where we are really talking about reimagining education, I know that's where we want to get to, we're at least having some really honest and transparent conversations and the acknowledgement of what we were doing wasn't working. And seeing how quickly educators were able to pivot and move to virtual, come back, go back to virtual, like seeing how quickly educators who really led the pathway, it was them on the front lines, that is my hope that we will continue on that trajectory. I also think that the inflection of funds that we have seen federally, it was a I never thought in my lifetime I would see this kind of investment of federal funds into education. My hope is, and to me, some of the bright spots are the innovative approaches that are happening at district levels. I think about on the mental health side, I've seen some districts use these dollars to have mental health coordinators to help not only students, but families access mental health services. That's huge. There's an acknowledgement of early childhood and the role that it plays in the longer education continuum, and we're finally talking about really beefing up early childhood. So these are bright spots to me that if we continue on this pathway, that even though we feel like we're in a hurricane right now, we're at least, when the winds calm down and subside, that we'll be on a pathway to a new version of education.
Absolutely. I mean, I believe storms are not only about the destruction they cause, they are about clearing the way, right? And so the storm we're in is absolutely about clearing the way for something different and better. So, Dr. Samuel, you are absolutely a systems catalyst. You absolutely are building your multi-sector experience, your proximity, your, purpose-lived life, and you're bringing all those things together to change the world. So, people listening, I'm sure, are, as I am, really just in awe of what you're doing and how you show up. If you were to say something to folks listening, or to maybe even your younger self, about what it takes to really stay the course as a systems change leader, what advice would you give, or what encouragement would you offer?
That's a good one that you didn't give me time to think about. Honestly, don't underestimate the value of the experiences, because every experience, good, bad, or indifferent, gives you a new tool for your toolbox that you don't know when you'll need. And across I think about professionally and even personally, some experiences, there are oftentimes I was embarrassed of them. Like I grew up on free and reduced lunch at a time when you got tickets, a colored ticket. And I was so embarrassed to have to turn that ticket over because everybody knew then that I was on free and reduced lunch. But now I'm an advocate for kids who come from low-income households. Now, when I speak to younger people, I can say, no, I know what it is, but let me tell you, stay the course, get your education, don't get, and look at where you can be. So all of those experiences just created new tools. And don't be afraid of those tools, because you truly never know when you'll need them.
Brilliant. That's a brilliant note to close on. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Tulaine.